Did the title get you to click? Good. We can also talk about when they succeed, through how they fail. Partisans, guerrillas, insurgents. These are some of the different types of forces formed by the local populace to oppose a larger invading force through some kind of unconventional military-style resistance. But almost everyone's image of this kind of military force is completely warped through pop culture and state-level propaganda. In order to understand it better, we have to do a little digging. In the 18th and 19th century, partisans referred to combatants who still fell under conventional military forces who used irregular tactics. In today's terms, partisans are individuals who are part of a resistance movement against a larger enemy. The French resistance in World War II is a good example, highlighting the fact that they may fall under an army, most often supplied by a foreign government, or non-state actors. Guerrillas are sometimes affiliated with a professional army, but are mainly fighters who use unconventional tactics and are in open conflict like the VC. They may work under the formal military, but are large enough to operate on their own. Insurgents are irregular forces, not under a formal military control, who have small underground groups and avoid open conflict when possible. There also is an element of political replacement through the methods of subversion intended to generate support and cover from the local populace. There is a fine line at this point where the force may devolve into something darker. Let's quickly go over some examples of each type of group to get a better understanding of the big picture. Mosby's Rangers were a formally incorporated cavalry unit of the CSA Army. Even though under formal military control, Mosby avoided saying troops or soldiers and preferred calling people under his command men and friends. They were not called guerrillas by the Southerners, but were referred to as such as an insult by the North because of the culturally dishonorable nature of quick raids at dawn or dusk and targeting of important individuals and supply lines. They would be relying on the foundations of modern maneuver warfare: speed, surprise, and violence of action. Also, crossing the line into espionage with blue overcoats over gray uniforms. According to a soldier of the war, Private Robert Knox Snaden, said in his diary that Mosby was an undersized, thin-visaged looking fellow with a sickly-looking yellow mustache. He wore a United States officer's blue overcoat over a uniform of gray. An act that would blur the lines of partisan warfare and espionage. Espionage carried the immediate sentence of death on both sides. The French resistance were a collection of various groups of civilians and former servicemen who provided intelligence, facilitated escape networks, and conducted sabotage and ambush tactics against occupying German forces. They were massively supported by the Allied armed forces and the OSS, receiving equipment to carry out operations and recognition as an integral part of the war effort. They not only fought, but published leaflets and newspapers as a way to further influence not only the civilians, but soldiers of the occupying army as well. William Quantrill formed his own group after joining with a group of slave-apprehending bandits. His group formally joined the CSA under the Partisan Ranger Act as an official unit within the Confederate military. The group was known for its brutality, but after the Lawrence Massacre, the Confederate government officially withdrew tacit support. The group spent a winter in Texas, and the 400-man unit split and became smaller guerrilla units after Quantrill lost the confidence and control of his group. One splinter guerrilla unit was led by William T. Anderson, aka Bloody Bill, the deadliest and most notorious guerrilla leader. He started off his guerrilla career as a horse thief and robber, and with sheer charisma was adept at manipulating the emotions of his men to fight fanatically. A young Jesse James served in this unit. Not only were the Viet Cong supported by the People's Army of Vietnam, they also had regular army units integrated into the organization. Using familial ties, they were effective at mobilizing civilian sympathizers, many who worked on both sides of the conflict. That same civilian support network also aided the massive logistics network running through numerous supply routes, most famously the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This led to a fighting style where they could come from anywhere, at any time. I did do a video on the New People's Army. Many fighters were roped in for ideological reasons, but criminals and people who used the organization for personal gain also joined through the years. The NPA tactics and culture within their organization is what eventually had them designated as a terrorist group. Abu Sayyaf, another ideological insurgent group in the Philippines, was recognized by most governments immediately as a terrorist group because of their methods of obtaining funding from crimes like drug running, extortion, sex slave trafficking, kidnappings, and assassination for hire. And who could forget the most well-known contender, the Taliban? Not only using violence against US-led coalition troops, but using its own socio-religious tribal political network to foster continued support from the local populace. But what about the Minutemen and Colonial militia? The Minutemen were special. They were a government-backed, part-time quick response force and formed 1/4 of the Colonial militia. The Colonial militia as a whole are why the National Guard traces its lineage back to 1636. They could be called upon by the government for any number of military functions. Depending on the region, local resources, and available manpower, the Colonial militia had different units that could fit all three aforementioned categories. To really complicate the ability to categorize this group neatly, as soon as a more professional military was being created out of the mix of part-time soldiers, average men with guns, hunters, and whoever else volunteered for the cause, it became very evident there was no uniform way to gauge overall capability accurately due to the mix of backgrounds. As noted by Continental soldier Benjamin Thompson, who expressed the common sentiment of the time that Minutemen marksmanship was overrated, that they were actually poor marksmen, and that some units simply wasted ammo. While all these types of forces fall under the blanket of irregular warfare, when we examine who achieved their goals, we see something very important. Insurgencies, partisan conflicts, guerrilla campaigns rarely win without extensive support and assistance. This is what's actually been researched and observed. This has led many groups to redefine what winning is. Many vets of GWAT reflect on Afghanistan. Ultimately, this is a case of perspective versus perception. And this hurts on so many levels, but examine it this way. From the underdog perspective, using redefined language, the irregular force can say they won. The larger force is withdrawing, the country is in chaos, and the former irregulars are now in charge. But in reality, we were never there to rebuild that nation, only to kill bin Laden and crush Al-Qaeda, which was accomplished. Removing the Taliban and ensuring women's rights and making the country a new example of democracy in action was just window dressing for the real mission, a punitive one.
For God and country, Geronimo.
The Costs of War project at Brown University estimated that 46,319 civilians, 52,893 opposition fighters, and 69,095 military personnel died. The military death rate includes Afghan National Army soldiers. The Taliban lost heavily militarily, with the USA accomplishing its main objectives. They were essentially given back the land to do with what they will, as protecting its peace and supporting it administratively was proving to be costly for America. The Viet Cong did gain a political victory, but at a terrifyingly heavy cost. They lost every major military engagement against US forces. Even the Vietnamese government's National Survey and Assessment of War Casualties concluded in 2017 that there were 849,018 PAVN military dead, with 232,000 missing and unaccounted for. The US military in comparison suffered 58,281 KIA, with 1,584 missing in action. The North regained control over South Vietnam through politics. Nixon was facing Watergate and political pressure to end an unpopular war at home. Both the Taliban and VC also had a deep well of young men with grievances that they could recruit from, with options for alternative work or safety being severely limited by war. As for our other examples from earlier, Abu Sayyaf has been crushed after 30 years with all of its leadership now dead or in prison, and about 11 fighters left on their roster who remain unaccounted for. The heaviest losses were taken during the siege of Marawi. The NPA is in a similar situation, with most groups now looking at a political means of winning rather than through armed conflict. The partisans and guerrillas of the Confederate States of America were eventually ambushed and killed, their group splintered, and men like Jesse James going on to live the life of an outlaw. But I left out the French resistance and the American colonial militia, didn't I? I did say rarely win. The French resistance received overwhelming Allied support to the point that they were directly working under OSS elements in Allied military command. The American colonials received aid from France, and the tide of battle for the colonists turned when Major General von Steuben reformed the Continental Army into a professional fighting force, establishing standards of sanitation, camp layouts, supply, and combat fitness and training. These small partisan-level groups, informal militias, conscripted out of need, won by becoming part of something much more lethal and organized. Ongoing irregular resistance elements such as the various groups in places like Burma are also holding the line through a combination of elements that work to their advantage, like terrain, public support, and the ability to move discreetly. In the end, support plays a pivotal role in a group's success or failure. Unless total war is enacted where every person who could retaliate is eliminated, irregular warfare will always be a threat that could arise in a conflict zone. It would serve a person who comes solely from a Western perspective to realize that even large-scale conflicts amount to a tribe fighting another tribe. Tribal warfare is still very much a thing in the 21st century. One can even apply this to cultural conflicts, with no overt battle space or army. A conflict of ideas. Creating a tribe that is fully supported by people is important. It is necessary. Until the next video, be good, stay safe, and have a good one.